I have been suing the government for a couple decades now. Um, but today I'd love to talk about this one specific lawsuit that I'm working on, which is against the governor of New York State and her Department of Health for their isolation and quarantine regulations.
I wanted to ask you about that. So let's break this down. My understanding of this bill is that they can force you into complying with quarantine regulations if you have any communicable disease. It's very vague. Can you walk me through it?
Sure, sure. So I want to make clear that it's actually not a proposed law. So it's not a bill, it is a regulation, which means that it was passed through an agency. And in this case, that's the Department of Health. So that's part of the problem, because the premise of the lawsuit is that an agency, in this case, the Department of Health here in New York State, doesn't have the power to make a regulation like this. So the regulation itself, the title is Isolation and Quarantine Procedures. It's 10 NYCRR 2.13. And what it says is it gives the Commissioner of Health here in New York State the power to pick and choose who should isolate or quarantine. Now, that could be in your home, or that could be they take you from your home and they force you to go to some sort of a facility, a detention center, a facility, whatever you want to call it. The Department of Health gets to decide how long you stay there, and they don't even have to prove that you actually have a communicable disease. The language is very broad, so they could just think you might possibly have been exposed to a communicable disease, and they could say, okay, come with us. And they take you, they put you into a facility. You don't have a say as to where you go, how long you stay there. There's no way to, prove, hey, look, I don't even have a communicable disease. That there's no escape clause like that put into this regulation. It's completely, it's mind-boggling how much power they've given themselves in this regulation. It
I was going to ask
violates,
about that. So how do
yeah.
we keep one branch of government from going full-blown tyranny in this case?
Correct. That's exactly what's going on here. So we have three branches of government. We've got the judicial branch, which is the courts and the judges. We've got the executive branch, which in this case is Governor Hochul, and then her agencies that are beneath her. And then you have the legislative branch. So the legislative branch is the branch that's supposed to make laws. And this regulation, which came from an agency in the executive branch, is really a law. They're calling it a regulation, but it's really a law. It has the same effect as a law would. And the legislature is the branch that's supposed to make law. And in this case, there was an assembly member in the legislature who for many years, he proposed a law that was very similar to this regulation. And year after year, he would put it forth. Nobody wanted to back it. No other legislators in the New York State legislature would touch it. They weren't interested in forcing New Yorkers to isolate and quarantine. So that assemblyman, it was Nick Perry, that assemblyman actually withdrew the bill in December of 2021 because he was getting such backlash from the community. People were just up in arms that how could you even propose such a terrible thing? So the legislature clearly did not want to pass a law like this. But so the governor and the Department of Health made it a regulation, which again, complete violation of separation of powers. You can't have one branch of government make law and then enforce the law, right? You're opening the door to tyranny if you allow that to happen. And that's why we brought this lawsuit, because we need to get the court to now step in and say, okay, executive branch, governor, Department of Health, you don't have the power to do this. This is something that the legislature would have to do if they wanted to do it, which we've already seen they don't want to do it because they had ample opportunity in the past few years if they wanted to make a law like this.
Have you ever seen anything like this in your entirety of practicing law in New York? This is crazy.
This overreach is unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's really, if this is allowed to stand, let's say the court doesn't strike this down. If this is allowed to stand, if you think about it, what does that do to the legislative branch of government? It nullifies it. It makes it pointless. It makes it useless, and it conflicts with laws that the legislature made. It's completely illegal. An agency is not allowed to do that. Agencies are supposed to supplement laws that are passed by the legislature. So if the legislature did want to force New Yorkers to isolate or quarantine, they could pass a law that says that. And then the agency could make rules to say how that's going to be enforced. How are we going to carry this out? So they're supposed to supplement what the legislature says to do in a specific law. But here, there's no law for them to rely upon. The legislature did not direct the Department of Health to make this regulation. So it's a dangerous situation, because if it's allowed to stand, hey, that means that any agency could just make a regulation that conflicts with current New York state law, and then it makes that law unenforceable, useless. You just have to, everybody has to stay in their lane, right? Each branch has their job. The other two branches are there to balance the other branch out. Everybody has to stay in their lane and do their job. You cannot have the executive branch crossing over into lawmaking. It's opens the door to tyranny 100%. And that's what we're seeing right now.
I agree with you. My understanding of this is that the state can utilize manpower from law enforcement to go and enforce this. So police officers can knock on people's doors and make sure that they're complying with quarantine regulations, or if not, they can take them away and bring them into one of these quarantine camps, which sounds, it's harsh, but I think that's the most accurate way to describe it, is a quarantine camp.
Yes, in fact, that is correct. The regulation has a provision that says that the governor, the Department of Health, can use local law enforcement to make sure that their orders of isolation and quarantine are being followed. So that means, yeah, the police can come knock on your door. And the other thing I want to point out is there's no age restriction in this regulation. So they could come knock on your door and tell you that you have to come with them to an isolation or a quarantine camp, or they could take your child, or they could take your elderly parent, or they could take your elderly grandparent. There's no restriction on age. It's unbelievable. They've given themselves this power. The power did not come from the state legislature. The power didn't come from the Constitution either. In fact, the New York State Constitution, which is similar, it's based on the federal Constitution. The New York State Constitution clearly says that New Yorkers will be protected by the Constitution from unreasonable searches and seizures. This is absolutely unreasonable. The regulation says that the Department of Health doesn't even have to prove that you're sick. It's so unbelievable, the broad power that they have given themselves in this regulation. And the plaintiffs that I'm representing are 3 New York State lawmakers and then a citizens group. So there's a New York State Senator, George Borrello. There's a New York State Assemblyman, Chris Tague, and then there's a New York State Assemblyman, Mike Lawler, together with this citizens group, which is called Uniting New York State. And that's who I'm representing as the plaintiffs. And the whole premise is that the governor and the Department of Health have usurped the power of the legislators. They're taking their power from them. Only legislators are supposed to be able to make laws. And then the citizens group is arguing that you're violating our rights. We have a right, as per the Constitution, to vote and choose who we want to be our representatives in the legislature and be our voice in the lawmaking process. So when the governor and Department of Health make a regulation, which is really a law. They're just calling it a regulation. But when they do that, they're taking away the voters' right to have a voice and a say in the lawmaking process.
Mhm.
And that's completely unconstitutional. You can't do that. Again, it leads itself to tyranny, right? It leads itself to a small group of people who, the agencies are run by people that are appointed. Those are not elected positions. So the commissioner of the Department of Health is appointed. And that's a perfect example of why you have representatives that you vote for in the legislature, because that's who you want to represent you. That's your voice in the lawmaking process. As soon as you let an agency make a law, now you've lost your voice. The citizens have no voice. They have no say. So it's very dangerous. This lawsuit is very important, not just for New Yorkers. It's really important for all Americans, because if it stands in New York and this regulation is allowed to continue, then other states are going to look at New York and say, hey, well,
Exactly.
New York is forcing their citizens to go into quarantine facilities. Why can't we do that? We should do that too. So once it's normalized in one state, the floodgates are open. Now many other states will look and say, oh, well, we can do it too. It's okay in New York. Why can't it be okay here? So it's very important that we stand up and fight this battle. It's crucial, not just to New York, but to states around the nation, really.
This has already been signed, right?
So the regulation is in effect. And to give a little bit of history on it, it actually was first promulgated under Governor Cuomo. So he was governor of New York right
Oh,
before.
I remember.
Yeah, you remember he had a couple scandals, so it might be a familiar name. So he was the governor in March of 2020 when the coronavirus pandemic started in New York. And at that time, March of 2020, the New York State Legislature gave him this incredible lawmaking power. They said, okay, it's a crisis. We don't know what's going on. We've never seen this before. We're going to give you the power to make, they called them directives, but they were really laws, mandates, whatever you want to call them. So he turned around, Governor Cuomo turned around and gave that power to the head of the Department of Health. And he said, in essence, do whatever you need to do. Let's stop this thing from spreading and hurting people. So the regulation was actually first promulgated in March of 2020 under Andrew Cuomo and his Department of Health. However, that was an emergency where the legislature actually passed a law to give him this power. They then took it back. So a year later, in March of 2021, they said, okay, there's no need for you to have all this power, right? It's no longer an emergency like it was in March of 2020. So they revoked the power. And then about 2 months later, 3 months later, Cuomo came out and said, okay, there's no more coronavirus pandemic in New York. It's not an emergency anymore. And so he withdrew all his prior executive orders, including the one that gave that power to the Department of Health. So the Department of Health lost the power to make that regulation, one, when Cuomo lost his power in March of 2021, but two, when in June of 2021, Cuomo revoked the power anyway. So now here we are a year later, and the Department of Health under a new governor is still making the same exact regulation. I mean, it's word for word the same. But where is their power coming from? That the legislature didn't give that special power to Governor Hochul. So there's no justification for them to have this regulation, which is the same exact regulation that was under Cuomo when he did have that special temporary power. So it's a really clear instance of the executive branch doing something they shouldn't be doing. And I don't know if their attitude is, hey, try and stop us. I mean, I'm really not sure what their attitude is about this, but it's very clear that at this point, we need the court to step in and to say, sorry, you can't do this. This is illegal, unconstitutional. You don't have basically, you don't have the power to do this.
This is already on the books. Today, somebody could have someone knock on their door and say, hey, we need to take your elderly parents, your children, you're coming with us.
Yes. Yep. It's in
And
effect.
you are now fighting this uphill battle. What's the next step to get this off of the books?
So we filed our lawsuit 4 or 5 weeks ago, and we're waiting now for the state. So the governor and the Department of Health are represented by the Attorney General in New York State. So the Attorney General's office has to answer our lawsuit, and they're supposed to do that this week. We also there are a group of New York State assemblymen who are supporting our case. They're not actually plaintiffs in our case, but they filed what's called an amicus brief. And that is a brief that you can file with the court if you're not a party to an action, but you have a very intense interest in the outcome of that lawsuit.
Are they trying to keep those quiet?
File this amicus brief. So,
are they trying to keep those briefs quiet?
Yeah. So the department, the Attorney General's office is fighting. They said, oh no, we don't want you to be able to file this amicus brief. So they're actually forcing these assemblymen they had to make a motion, like a formal motion to the court, and ask permission from the court. Hey, can we file this brief? Because they want to support us. They want to support the plaintiffs. So the Attorney General's office is saying, oh no, you can't do that. So this week, by Friday, the Attorney General's office is supposed to put in their opposition papers. And I'm interested to read and see what their justification is for not wanting an amicus brief to be filed. It's very rare that somebody would oppose the filing of an amicus brief in a case. So it's not like a standard thing that happens all the time. But yeah, the Attorney General's office is fighting against the amicus brief. They also had a nice stall tactic they pulled on us in the very beginning. Instead of answering our lawsuit, they removed the case to federal court because we filed in New York State court. They removed it to federal court, and they tried to say, oh, this is a federal issue, federal law. They tried to say we're making federal claims. It was not true. But, they wanted to stall the case. They didn't want it to get going and have momentum and whatnot. So we had to make a motion in federal court to ask the federal judge to remand the case back to state court, which is where it belongs. This is New York State law we're talking about, which they did. The federal judge did rule in our favor, and he sent the case back to state court. So, it was a delay tactic. It was a stall tactic. We lost some time, wasted in federal court trying to get back to state court, but ultimately we're back in state court. So we'll see. We have oral arguments on the case the end of May. So we'll see how it goes, but it's super important that people hear about this. And I'm so happy to be on your show, because a lot of people don't know about this regulation. Even New Yorkers don't know about this regulation. They're trying to keep it secret. They're trying to keep it under wraps, but it's on the books, and they're trying to make it permanent. They did it as an emergency regulation, but they're also trying to make it permanent now so that they can just come whenever they want and take you from your home, or force you to stay in your home and not be able to go to work or go out or be around people. I mean, it's unbelievable how much power they've given themselves in this regulation and how anti-American it is. I mean, since when can the government tell you that we think you might be a health threat? They don't even have to prove it, and they can force you to stay in your house for however many days or weeks or months, or they can take you from your house and put you into a facility for, again, there's no time limit. It could be a few days, a few weeks, a few months, a few years. I mean, there's just no time limit at all. So it's unbelievable. It's really important that we spread the word, let people know about this. And there are a lot of ways people can support the case if they want. We have a website specifically designated for the lawsuit that people could check out and get information. We have videos on there, photographs, a copy of our press conference, our press release. There's a lot of information on there if people want to check it out and get more details.
I'll link to it in the description of this video so people can go ahead and check it out, along to the text for this regulation itself, so they can go and see that this is in fact real. Because it is mind-boggling to think that this is where we're at, but also not surprising if you've been paying attention. And I do think more people need to know about this, if you live in New York especially, but even if you don't, because it could become a New York state next.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of times things that start in New York end up spreading across the country.
California too.
Right. We
The
seem
gift
to
that
be,
keeps on giving.
Yep, the two states that come up with these things, and then they go across the country. And when something gets really popular, when a law gets really popular that almost every single state in the nation is adopting a similar type of law, a lot of times it leads to the federal government then making it a federal law, because they figure, oh, well, look, all these states are passing the same law. They obviously all support this. So a lot of times it leads to the federal government making a law. That's the last thing we want, is to have the federal government step in and say, we can lock, in essence, we can lock you up without any due process whenever we want, if we just suspect you might maybe have been exposed to a communicable disease. I mean, the power is just unbridled, right? It needs to be reined back in immediately before it gets out of hand. I mean, look at what's going on in China right now. You know, you see on the news these videos of these, I mean, what do you call them? Camps, facilities, detention centers, one after the other, after the other, after the, and they're doing this. They're taking people, they're saying, oh, well, we think maybe you're sick, you know, and they're throwing them in there. This regulation allows the New York State Department of Health to do the same exact thing.